Good evening. In the spring of 1917, Black Bill Walker stood at the edge of Walker Valley, watching smoke rise from what remained of his cabin, his weathered hands gripping the barrel of his legendary rifle, Old Death. At 78 years old, most men would have been preparing for the grave, but Bill Walker wasn't most men. The 6'2" mountaineer who could still click his heels together twice before hitting the ground was about to begin the deadliest hunt of his life. Not for bear or deer, but for the six Sevier County deputies who had just murdered his three wives in cold blood during a raid that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with timber company greed and religious persecution. Before we begin, understand that this story contains a dramatized account of systematic violence during the early 20th century, when law enforcement corruption was rampant in Appalachian communities, when timber companies wielded sheriff's departments as private armies, and when men who refused to conform to conventional morality became targets for elimination under the guise of legal authority. If you're ready to hear how the legendary bear hunter became an avenging angel in the Great Smoky Mountains, systematically tracking six corrupt deputies through the wilderness he knew better than any man alive, hit that subscribe button. The Great Smoky Mountains of East Tennessee occupied some of the most rugged territory in North America in 1917. Dense forests of virgin chestnuts, oaks, and poplars covered mountains that rose 6,000 feet into clouds that seemed to hover perpetually over the highest peaks. The region was populated by fiercely independent families who had settled the area generations earlier, establishing homesteads in isolated valleys where they could live according to their own codes, largely free from outside interference. Walker Valley sat at the base of Fodder Stack Mountain, accessible only by following the middle prong of the Little River upstream from Tuckaleechee Cove. The valley encompassed nearly 8 square miles of fertile bottomland and surrounding forest, all of it owned by Bill Walker, who had claimed the land in 1859 when he and his first wife Nancy had ventured into the wilderness to establish their homestead. For 58 years, Bill had transformed the isolated valley into a thriving community, building cabins, establishing gristmills, maintaining over 100 beehives, and raising 26 children with his three wives. Bill Walker was born in 1838 in Tuckaleechee Cove, son of John Walker, a circuit-riding preacher who had fought at the Battle of Kings Mountain during the American Revolution. Bill grew up learning the mountains intimately, studying animal behavior, tracking deer and bear, learning to read weather patterns and the movement of clouds and the behavior of birds. By age 21, he stood over 6 feet 2 inches tall, weighed 190 pounds of lean muscle, and had developed a reputation as the finest hunter in the Smokies. His rifle, Old Death, was a 6-foot Kentucky long rifle that had belonged to his father, used during the Revolution. The weapon weighed over 20 pounds and could shoot a 2-ounce ball with accuracy at 200 yards. Bill had killed hundreds of deer and bear with Old Death, including a legendary hunt where he tracked and killed 6 bears in 24 hours, and another occasion where he entered a cave with only a sharpened hickory spear to kill a bear when the rifle wouldn't fit through the entrance. Bill's religious views were as legendary as his hunting prowess. He had grown up reading the Bible with his father, memorizing entire books of scripture, particularly fascinated by Old Testament prophets like Jacob, David, and Solomon. Bill noted that these great men had multiple wives and interpreted this as biblical approval for plural marriage. In 1849, after 10 years of marriage to Nancy Kaler, who had borne him 7 children, Bill brought Mary Moore into their household as a common-law wife. Nancy served as midwife when Mary's 7 children were born. Years later, Bill brought Molly Stinnett into the family, who bore 12 more children. The arrangement was unconventional but functional. Bill built separate cabins for Mary and Molly on opposite sides of the middle prong, while maintaining the main homestead with Nancy. The 3 women cooperated in raising the children, managing the household operations, and maintaining the extensive agricultural activities that sustained the valley community. Bill divided his time equally among the 3 families, provided for all his children, and maintained respect throughout the region as a skilled craftsman, generous neighbor, and principled conservationist who refused to sell his virgin timber to the logging companies that were devastating the surrounding mountains. By 1917, the timber industry had transformed the Great Smoky Mountains from pristine wilderness into industrial extraction zone. Companies like the Little River Lumber Company had purchased hundreds of thousands of acres, laid railroad tracks deep into the mountains, and systematically clear-cut forests that had stood for centuries. Ancient chestnuts, some nearly 1,000 years old, fell to saws operated by crews who moved through the mountains like locusts, leaving behind devastated landscapes where erosion destroyed streams and wildlife populations collapsed. Bill Walker's refusal to sell his 8 square miles of virgin forest made Walker Valley an anomaly, an island of intact ecosystem surrounded by scalped mountains and industrial operations. The timber companies had offered increasingly large sums for Bill's property, but he had refused every offer. Determined to preserve the forest he loved and to maintain his family's independence on land they had developed over nearly 6 decades. The timber company's frustration with Bill's refusal to sell had combined with local authorities' discomfort regarding his plural marriage arrangement to create a situation where eliminating Bill Walker and seizing his property became objective, shared by commercial and law enforcement interests. Sevier County Sheriff Thomas Brennan had been receiving payments from Little River Lumber Company since 1914 in exchange for facilitating land acquisitions through various means, including intimidation, false legal claims, and occasionally violence against property owners who refused to sell. Brennan had identified Bill Walker as a particular problem because the old mountaineer's reputation and principled resistance to timber sales had inspired other property owners to refuse company offers. If Walker could be eliminated and his property seized, it would break the resistance and allow final consolidation of timber company control throughout the region. The plan required legal pretext that would justify violent action against Bill's family while appearing to serve legitimate law enforcement purpose. The pretext came in the form of Tennessee's anti-polygamy statutes, laws that had rarely been enforced in Appalachian communities where common law marriages and informal domestic arrangements were widespread, but which provided convenient legal justification for raiding households that authorities wanted to disrupt. Brennan obtained warrant in March 1917, charging Bill Walker with unlawful cohabitation, alleging that his household arrangement with Nancy, Mary, and Molly violated state law prohibiting polygamy. The warrant was legally questionable because Bill had only been formally married to Nancy, while Mary and Molly were common law wives, an arrangement that might not have met statutory definition of polygamy. But Brennan wasn't concerned with legal technicalities. The warrant provided justification for raid that would terrorize Bill's family, potentially provoke violent response that could justify killing Bill, and ultimately clear the way for timber company seizure of Walker Valley property. March 15, 1917 dawned cold and clear in Walker Valley. Bill had risen before sunrise, as was his habit, and headed up Fodder Stack Mountain to check his trap lines, leaving Nancy, Mary, and Molly to manage the morning household activities. Several of Bill's adult children were working at various locations throughout the valley, tending livestock, maintaining equipment, and preparing fields for spring planting. The valley was going about its normal routine when 6 mounted deputies led by Sheriff Brennan rode up the Middle Prong Trail into Walker Valley around mid-morning. The deputies were Deputy Marshal Frank Patterson, Deputy John Whitlock, Deputy Samuel Hayes, Deputy Robert Morrison, Deputy Thomas Mitchell, and Deputy Marcus Sutton. All 6 men had been specifically selected by Brennan for this operation because they were willing to follow orders without asking questions, because they understood that timber company interests took precedence over legal niceties, and because they could be trusted to use whatever force Brennan deemed necessary to accomplish the mission. The raid began at Nancy's cabin, the main homestead where Bill and Nancy had raised their 7 children over nearly 7 decades. Nancy, now 78 years old, was preparing bread when the deputies kicked in the door without announcing themselves or presenting the warrant they claimed authorized their presence. Deputy Patterson grabbed Nancy by her arm, demanding to know where Bill was hiding, while Deputy Whitlock began ransacking the cabin, overturning furniture and scattering possessions while searching for evidence of polygamy or anything else that might justify expanded charges. Nancy refused to cooperate, told Patterson that Bill was checking trap lines and wouldn't return until evening, demanded that deputies leave her property immediately. Her defiance enraged Patterson, who struck Nancy across the face with sufficient force to knock the elderly woman to the floor. When Nancy attempted to rise, Patterson kicked her in the ribs, breaking several bones and causing internal injuries that would prove fatal. The violence against Nancy brought several of Bill's adult children running from adjacent areas where they had been working. Bill's son William, age 49, arrived first, attempting to intervene as Patterson continued beating Nancy. Deputy Whitlock shot William in the chest at point-blank range, killing him instantly. The gunshot brought more family members running, including Bill's daughters Sarah and Martha, both in their 40s, who attempted to help their dying mother while pleading with deputies to stop the violence. Sheriff Brennan, who had remained mounted outside the cabin during the initial assault, ordered his deputies to secure Mary and Molly's cabins across the river. Deputies Hayes, Morrison, Mitchell, and Sutton rode to Mary Moore's cabin, where Mary, age 65, was working in her garden when the deputies arrived. When Mary attempted to flee toward the woods, Deputy Hayes shot her in the back, killing her before she reached the tree line. Molly Stinnett, age 60, heard the gunshots and attempted to barricade herself in her cabin with her two youngest children. Deputies Morrison and Mitchell broke down the door, dragged Molly outside, and beat her with rifle butts while demanding she reveal where Bill kept his money and valuables. When Molly insisted there was no hidden money, that Bill's wealth was in his land and livestock, Deputy Morrison shot her execution style through the head. The massacre lasted less than 30 minutes. 3 of Bill's wives were dead, his son William was dead, and several of his children had been beaten or threatened during the raid that had supposedly been conducted to serve warrant for unlawful cohabitation. Sheriff Brennan made no attempt to arrest anyone, made no effort to secure evidence of alleged crimes, instead ordered his deputies to burn Nancy's cabin to destroy evidence of the violence that had occurred inside. As smoke rose from the burning cabin, Brennan and his 6 deputies rode back down the Middle Prong Trail toward Tuckaleechee Cove, believing they had successfully eliminated Bill Walker's family and cleared the way for Timber Company's seizure of Walker Valley. They had no idea they had just signed their own death warrants by murdering the wives of a man who knew every ridge, hollow, and game trail in 10,000 acres of mountain wilderness, who possessed the legendary Old Death rifle that had killed hundreds of animals at ranges exceeding 200 yards, and who had just been transformed from peaceful conservationist into avenging angel with nothing left to lose. Bill Walker returned to Walker Valley late that afternoon, descending from Stack Mountain with several rabbits and a turkey he had shot during the day's hunting. He smelled the smoke before he saw it, quickened his pace as he approached the valley floor, broke into a run when he saw the blackened ruins of Nancy's cabin. The scene that greeted him was beyond comprehension. His wife Nancy lay dying in Sarah's arms, her face swollen from Patterson's beating, her breathing shallow and labored from broken ribs that had punctured her lung. William's body lay covered with a blanket near the cabin ruins. Across the river, Mary's body remained where she had fallen in her garden, and Molly's body lay in front of her cabin, the back of her head destroyed by Morrison's execution shot. Bill knelt beside Nancy, held her hand as she struggled to speak, listened as she described the raid, identified the 6 deputies by name, explained that Sheriff Brennan had ordered the attack. Nancy died at sunset. Her final words a request that Bill not seek vengeance, that he protect the surviving children rather than pursuing deputies who would kill him if he attempted retaliation. Bill closed Nancy's eyes, remained kneeling beside her body as darkness fell over Walker Valley. As his surviving children gathered around the 3 dead women and his murdered son, as the full weight of what had been taken from him settled into his bones like a cold that would never lift, the old mountaineer stood slowly, walked to his cabin, retrieved Old Death from above the fireplace where the rifle had hung for 58 years. The weapon felt familiar in his hands, the weight distributed perfectly along its 6-foot length, the stock worn smooth from decades of use. Bill loaded the rifle with powder and ball, checked the flint, satisfied himself that Old Death remained as deadly as it had been during hundreds of hunts across 6 decades. Tomorrow he would bury his wives and his son. Tomorrow night he would begin hunting the 6 deputies who had destroyed his family. And unlike the bears and deer he had tracked throughout his life, these men would not die quickly or cleanly. They would die knowing exactly why they were being killed, would have time to understand that badges provided no protection against a man defending his family's honor in mountains where law enforcement authority meant nothing compared to the ancient codes that governed mountain justice. If this story has drawn you into the tragedy that transformed America's greatest bear hunter into judge, jury, and executioner for 6 corrupt deputies, leave your like and share. Subscribe for Part 2, where Bill Walker begins his systematic hunt through the Great Smoky Mountains, where deputies who thought they could murder with impunity discover that Old Death speaks with authority that no badge can silence, and where we'll examine how a 78-year-old man transformed grief into campaign of justice that would become legend throughout Appalachia. The morning of March 16, 1917, broke cold and gray over Walker Valley. Bill Walker had not slept, had spent the night sitting beside the bodies of Nancy, Mary, and Molly, laid out in what remained of the main cabin's front room. His surviving children, 22 of them still living, ranging in age from 15 to 53, had gathered throughout the night, arriving from various locations throughout the valley and surrounding area where they had established their own homesteads. They found their father transformed, the jovial storyteller and generous neighbor replaced by something harder and colder, a man who spoke in clipped sentences and whose eyes held a flat intensity that made even his adult sons uncomfortable. Bill directed the burial preparations with military precision. William would be buried first in the family cemetery on the hillside above Nancy's burned cabin. Then Nancy, Mary, and Molly would be laid to rest beside him, all four graves dug deep into the mountain soil that Bill had worked for 58 years. Several of his sons and grandsons worked throughout the morning, excavating the graves, while Bill's daughters prepared the bodies, washing away the blood and dirt, dressing their mothers in their best clothing, the simple homespun dresses that mountain women wore for church services and special occasions. By early afternoon, the entire Walker clan had assembled at the cemetery. Bill stood at the head of the four open graves, Old Death leaning against his shoulder, his massive frame seeming even larger in his grief. He spoke without notes, without hesitation, his voice carrying across the assembled family with the authority of an Old Testament prophet delivering judgment. Nancy, Mary, and Molly were murdered yesterday by 6 deputies led by Sheriff Thomas Brennan. They died because I refused to sell this land to timber companies who want to destroy these mountains the way they've destroyed everything around us. They died because we lived according to our own understanding of Scripture, harming no one, raising our children in the fear of God and the love of these mountains. William died trying to protect his mother from men who wore badges but acted like animals. Bill paused, his gaze moving across his children and grandchildren, making eye contact with each person present. The law will do nothing about these murders. Sheriff Brennan serves timber company interests, not justice. The courts will rule that deputies were serving a warrant, that any violence was justified by our family's resistance, even though Nancy was 78 years old and unarmed, even though Mary was shot in the back while fleeing, even though Molly was executed after being beaten. The old mountaineer lifted Old Death, held the rifle across his chest. I am 78 years old. My wives are dead. My son is dead. I have lived a long life in these mountains, learned their ways, tracked every animal that walks these ridges. I know things about survival and hunting that these deputies can't imagine. They think badges protect them. They think riding back to Sevierville makes them safe. They're wrong. Bill's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but every person in the cemetery heard him clearly. I'm going to kill all 6 deputies who came into Walker Valley yesterday. I'm going to hunt them the way I've hunted bear for 60 years. They'll die knowing why. They'll die understanding that murdering innocent women has consequences that badges can't prevent. And when I'm done, everyone in these mountains will know that timber companies and corrupt sheriffs can't kill with impunity, that some men will deliver justice when the law refuses to. Several of Bill's sons tried to dissuade him, argued that pursuing deputies would only result in his own death, that protecting the surviving family members was more important than seeking vengeance. Bill's response was simple and final. I'm an old man. I've lived my life. Your mothers can't be allowed to die unavenged. If I do nothing, it tells every corrupt lawman in Tennessee that mountain families can be murdered without consequences. That's not a legacy I'm leaving for my children and grandchildren. The family buried Nancy, Mary, Molly, and William as sunset approached, each grave marked with a simple wooden cross bearing the deceased's name and date of death. As the last shovel of earth was placed on Molly's grave, Bill turned away from the cemetery, walked to his remaining cabin, and began preparing for a hunt that would last considerably longer than the single day it took to kill 6 bears. Bill's preparation was methodical and thorough, reflecting 6 decades of hunting experience and the military discipline his father had instilled in him as a boy. He packed a leather shoulder bag with powder, lead balls, patches, and cleaning supplies for Old Death. He filled a canteen with water from the middle prong. He wrapped dried venison and cornbread in cloth, enough food for 3 days in the mountains. He included a whetstone for sharpening his knife, a small pot for making coffee, and a wool blanket for sleeping in the mountains if necessary. Most importantly, Bill studied what he knew about the 6 deputies' routines, residential locations, and probable movements over the coming days. Deputy Marshal Frank Patterson lived on a small farm outside Sevierville, approximately 15 miles from Walker Valley. Deputy John Whitlock maintained a home in Sevierville proper, close to the courthouse. Deputies Samuel Hayes and Robert Morrison both lived in the Pigeon Forge area, about 12 miles from Walker Valley. Deputies Thomas Mitchell and Marcus Sutton resided in smaller communities along the route between Sevierville and Tuckaleechee Cove. Bill's advantage was intimate knowledge of every trail, ridge, and crossing point between Walker Valley and these locations. The deputies would use established roads, believing themselves safe in populated areas, unable to imagine that a 78-year-old man would pursue them into territory they considered secure. But Bill had traveled these mountains for 60 years, knew shortcuts and game trails that reduced distances significantly, could move through forests silently while deputies would announce their presence on roads used by wagons and horses. The first target would be Deputy Marshal Frank Patterson, the man who had beaten Nancy to death, who had struck a defenseless 78-year-old woman hard enough to break her ribs and cause fatal internal injuries. Patterson lived farthest from Walker Valley, which meant he would feel most secure, least likely to expect retaliation so soon after the raid. Bill planned to reach Patterson's farm by dawn on March 17th, approximately 36 hours after the murders. Before news of Bill's intentions could spread throughout the law enforcement community, Bill left Walker Valley at midnight on March 16th, moving silently through darkness along trails he could have followed blindfolded. He crossed Thunderhead Mountain at an elevation of 5,500 feet, descended into Tennessee Valley systems that led toward Sevierville, covered over 12 miles by the time dawn broke on March the 17th. He positioned himself on a wooded ridge overlooking Patterson's farm around 6 in the morning, settled into a concealed position behind a fallen chestnut log approximately 200 yards from the deputy's house. Patterson's farm consisted of a modest frame house, a barn, several outbuildings, and about 40 acres of cleared land surrounded by forest. Bill watched through the morning as Patterson emerged from his house, performed his morning chores, fed livestock, and eventually walked to his barn to harness a horse to a wagon. The deputy moved casually, showing no sign of concern or awareness that he might be in danger, apparently confident that the previous day's massacre would have no consequences beyond whatever fabricated report Sheriff Brennan had filed justifying the raid. Bill waited until Patterson led the harnessed horse out of the barn, until the deputy stood in open ground with no cover between his position and the tree line where Bill lay concealed. The range was approximately 180 yards, well within Old Death's capability. Bill rested the long rifle across the fallen log, sighted carefully on Patterson's center mass, controlled his breathing the way he had done thousands of times while hunting, and squeezed the trigger. The report echoed across the valley as Old Death sent its 2-ounce ball through the morning air. Patterson jerked backward as the ball struck him in the chest, stumbled several steps, and collapsed in his farmyard. Bill reloaded quickly, a process he could complete in under 30 seconds after 6 decades of practice, kept the rifle trained on Patterson's position while watching for any signs of life. The deputy did not move. Bill remained in position for another 10 minutes, ensuring no one else was present at the farm, that Patterson was certainly dead, that no witnesses had observed the shot. Satisfied that the first target had been eliminated, Bill rose from his concealed position, melted back into the forest, and began moving toward his second target, Deputy John Whitlock, who lived in Sevierville approximately 8 miles from Patterson's farm. The route to Sevierville required careful planning because the town represented a populated area where Bill could not move as freely as he did in the wilderness. But Bill had visited Sevierville regularly throughout his life, knew the layout of streets and buildings, understood how to approach Whitlock's residence from the wooded areas that surrounded the town. More importantly, Bill understood that no one would expect him to strike again so quickly, that authorities would assume Patterson's death was an isolated incident requiring investigation before determining whether additional security measures were necessary. Bill reached the outskirts of Sevierville by early afternoon on March 17th. Whitlock's house sat on the eastern edge of town, a small frame structure with a garden plot and chicken coop, typical of homes occupied by working-class families in small Tennessee towns. Bill positioned himself in woods behind Whitlock's property, approximately 150 yards from the house, and settled in to wait for an opportunity. Whitlock emerged from his house around 4 in the afternoon, walking toward his chicken coop to collect eggs before evening. Bill waited until Whitlock was bent over near the coop entrance, until the deputy's profile presented clear target against the white-painted coop wall. Old Death spoke again, the ball striking Whitlock in the side, penetrating his lung and heart, killing him before he could understand what had happened. The shot drew immediate attention from Whitlock's neighbors. Bill heard shouting, saw people running toward the fallen deputy, knew he had perhaps 2 minutes before someone thought to check the woods behind Whitlock's property. He moved immediately, not running, but walking quickly through the forest, putting distance between himself and the shooting location, using the terrain to mask his movement from anyone who might be looking from town. By sunset on March the 17th, Bill was 5 miles from Sevierville, concealed in a laurel thicket where he could rest for several hours while eating dried venison and considering his next moves. 2 deputies were dead within 12 hours, both killed at ranges exceeding 150 yards by a weapon that most law enforcement officers would have considered obsolete compared to modern repeating rifles. But Old Death's age was deceptive. The Kentucky long rifle remained one of the most accurate weapons ever made for long-range shooting by a skilled marksman, and Bill Walker had been practicing with this particular rifle for 60 years. News of the 2 murders would spread throughout Sevier County by morning of March 18th. Sheriff Brennan would understand immediately who was responsible, would warn the 4 surviving deputies that Bill Walker was hunting them systematically. But warning the deputies and protecting them were different matters. Brennan could not keep 4 men under 24-hour guard indefinitely. The deputies had homes, families, jobs that required them to move around the county. And Bill had unlimited time, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and the patience of a man who had spent 6 decades tracking wary animals through mountain wilderness. The hunt had only begun, and the 4 surviving deputies were already starting to understand the terrible mistake they had made by murdering 3 elderly women and a middle-aged man in Walker Valley. They had awakened something in these mountains, something older and more dangerous than modern law enforcement, something that answered to codes that predated badges and statutes. They had made an enemy of the greatest hunter the Great Smoky Mountains had ever produced, and Bill Walker was just getting started. Bill spent March 18th resting in the mountains, allowing his body to recover from the exertion of covering over 20 miles of rough terrain and eliminating 2 targets within 12 hours. At 78 years old, he still possessed remarkable physical capability, but he understood the importance of pacing himself, of not pushing his aging body beyond its limits when the hunt was far from finished. He slept during the day in his laurel thicket, woke at sunset, ate more dried venison, and began planning his approach to the 3rd target. Deputy Samuel Hayes lived in the Pigeon Forge area, approximately 10 miles from Bill's current position. Hayes had been part of the group that had killed Mary Moore, shooting her in the back as she fled toward the woods. Bill wanted Hayes to know why he was dying, wanted the deputy to understand in his final moments that murdering defenseless women carried consequences that badges could not prevent. Bill reached the vicinity of Hayes's residence by midnight on March 18th. The deputy lived in a cabin on a small plot of land about 2 miles outside Pigeon Forge proper, isolated enough that Bill could approach closely without risk of detection by neighbors. Bill positioned himself in woods adjacent to Hayes's cabin, settled into another concealed position behind a deadfall, and waited for dawn. Hayes emerged from his cabin around 7 in the morning on March 19th, carrying a rifle. Apparently, Sheriff Brennan had warned the surviving deputies that Bill was hunting them, and Hayes had armed himself accordingly. But carrying a rifle and knowing how to use it effectively were different things, and Hayes's nervous movements as he scanned the surrounding forest suggested he was terrified rather than confident. Bill waited until Hayes walked toward his well to draw water, until the deputy set his rifle against the well housing to operate the hand pump. The moment Hayes released his weapon, Bill stood from his concealed position, stepped into the open approximately 50 yards from the well, and called out, "Samuel Hayes?" The deputy spun toward the voice, reaching for his rifle, freezing when he saw the massive figure of Bill Walker standing at the edge of the forest with Old Death leveled at his chest. Bill's voice carried clearly across the distance. "You shot Mary Moore in the back 3 days ago. Killed a 65-year-old woman who never harmed anyone? Now you're going to die understanding why." Hayes tried to grab his rifle. Bill fired, the ball striking Hayes in the abdomen, not killing him immediately but inflicting a mortal wound that would take hours to complete its work. Bill reloaded as Hayes collapsed beside the well, walked forward until he stood directly over the dying deputy, looked down at the man who was clutching his stomach and moaning in agony. "This is what you and the others did," Bill said quietly. "You brought death into my valley, killed my wives, killed my son. I'm going to kill all 6 of you. Tell Sheriff Brennan that when you see him in hell, if you live long enough to get word to anyone." Bill turned away from Hayes, walked back into the forest, left the deputy to die slowly beside his well. The shot had been intentionally placed to cause maximum suffering, rather than quick death, a departure from Bill's normal hunting practice of killing cleanly, but reflecting the old mountaineer's judgment that Hayes deserved to experience fear and pain before death claimed him. 3 deputies dead in 3 days, 3 more remaining. And Sheriff Brennan was beginning to understand that he had created a situation beyond his control, that Bill Walker was not going to stop until all 6 deputies who had participated in the Walker Valley massacre were dead, that no amount of law enforcement resources could protect men from a hunter who knew every square mile of these mountains better than they knew their own properties. The hunt continued, and the Great Smoky Mountains, which had witnessed Bill Walker's legendary hunts for 60 years, were now witnessing his final and deadliest pursuit. Old Death had spoken 3 times, and 3 men had fallen. The rifle would speak 3 more times before Bill's vengeance was complete, before the balance that had been destroyed on March 15th. 1917 was restored through the ancient mountain justice that required blood for blood, death for death, and accountability for those who believed their badges placed them above the codes that govern these hills. If you're captivated by this tale of how corrupt deputies learned that murdering innocent mountain families carried consequences they never imagined, that a 78-year-old bear hunter with a Revolutionary War rifle could systematically eliminate trained law enforcement officers through superior knowledge of terrain and 6 decades of tracking experience, leave your like and share. Subscribe for part 3, where Bill Walker continues his systematic hunt through the Great Smokies, where the 3 surviving deputies discover that neither Sheriff Brennan nor the timber companies can protect them from Old Death's judgment, and where we'll see how this deadly campaign forced reckoning with corruption that had plagued Appalachian law enforcement for decades. The death of Deputy Samuel Hayes on March 19th sent shockwaves through Sevier County law enforcement. 3 deputies dead in 4 days, each killed by precision rifle fire from distances that suggested military-grade marksmanship, each murder demonstrating that Bill Walker possessed capabilities that Sheriff Brennan had catastrophically underestimated. The timber companies that had paid Brennan to eliminate Bill Walker's resistance to selling Walker Valley were now pressuring the sheriff to end the crisis before publicity surrounding the murders damaged their operations and drew unwanted attention to the corrupt relationship between Little River Lumber Company and local law enforcement. Brennan called an emergency meeting on March 20th with the 3 surviving deputies, Robert Morrison, Thomas Mitchell, and Marcus Sutton, along with additional officers from surrounding counties who had been brought in to assist with protection details. The meeting took place in the Sevier County Courthouse behind locked doors, with armed guards posted outside to prevent any possibility of Bill Walker attempting an attack on the assembled officers. Brennan's opening statement was blunt. Bill Walker has killed 3 of our men in 4 days. Patterson, Whitlock, and Hayes are dead because we underestimated a 78-year-old man who knows these mountains better than anyone alive. Walker is hunting you 3 specifically because you participated in the raid on Walker Valley. He's not going to stop until you're all dead or until we kill him first. Deputy Robert Morrison, who had executed Molly Stinnett with a shot to the back of her head, spoke up. How is one old man with an antique rifle killing trained deputies? We're armed with modern weapons. We know he's hunting us, and he's still picking us off like we're deer in the woods. Brennan's response revealed the depth of the problem they faced. Bill Walker spent 60 years hunting in these mountains. He can move through forest without making a sound. He knows every trail, every ridge, every place where he can set up a concealed position with clear line of fire. Most importantly, he's patient. He'll wait hours or days for the perfect shot. You men are used to serving warrants and making arrests in situations where you control the encounter. Walker is fighting on his terms, in his territory, using tactics that none of you have trained for. Deputy Thomas Mitchell, who had helped beat Molly Stinnett before Morrison executed her, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. So what's the plan? We can't stay locked in this courthouse forever. We have families, homes, jobs. How do we stop him? Brennan had no good answer because there was no good answer. Deploying deputies to patrol the mountains looking for Bill would expose them to ambush in terrain where the old mountaineer held every advantage. Keeping the 3 surviving deputies under constant guard was unsustainable. Attempting to negotiate with Bill was pointless. The man had made clear through his actions that he intended to kill everyone who had participated in murdering his wives and son. The only realistic option was to fortify the deputies' homes, assign protection details, and hope that Bill would make a mistake that would allow law enforcement to locate and eliminate him before he completed his systematic elimination of the raid participants. The plan implemented on March 20th assigned 4-man protection details to each surviving deputy, rotating guards who would maintain watch on the deputies' residences 24 hours a day. Additional patrols would monitor roads and trails between Sevierville and the mountain areas where Bill might be operating. Brennan also sent word to Bill's surviving children that their father would be shot on sight, that any family members found harboring or assisting him would be arrested and prosecuted as accessories to murder. The threat against Bill's family was a miscalculation that demonstrated Brennan's fundamental misunderstanding of mountain culture. Bill's children had no intention of interfering with their father's campaign. They understood that what Bill was doing was necessary according to the codes that had governed these mountains for generations, that allowing the murders of Nancy, Mary, Molly, and William to go unavenged would have marked the entire Walker family as weak and vulnerable to future attacks. The children would not actively assist Bill's hunt, but neither would they cooperate with authorities attempting to stop him. Bill spent March 20th and 21st observing the enhanced security measures that Brennan had implemented. He watched from concealed positions as guards were posted at Morrison's residence, noted the patrol patterns that deputies were following along roads leading into the mountains, studied the routines that the protection details were establishing. The old hunter understood immediately that the increased security made quick kills impossible, that he would need to be more patient and more creative to reach the remaining 3 targets. The key vulnerability in Brennan's security plan was that the protection details were composed of deputies who were not mountain men, who did not understand wilderness survival or tracking, who became bored and complacent after hours of watching empty forests. Bill recognized that the guards would be most vulnerable during shift changes, during moments when one detail was leaving and another arriving, when attention was divided and procedures were relaxed. Deputy Robert Morrison lived in a cabin approximately 3 miles outside Pigeon Forge, surrounded by cleared fields that provided little cover for approaching attackers. Brennan had assigned a 4-man protection detail that maintained position in Morrison's barn, from which they could observe all approaches to the cabin. The security seemed adequate until Bill recognized that the guards were not watching the forest behind the barn itself, were focused entirely on approaches to the main cabin where Morrison and his family lived. Bill studied the situation for 2 full days, noted that the protection detail changed at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, that during these transition periods the guards gathered outside the barn to exchange information and receive instructions from the departing detail leader. The gathering created a window of approximately 10 minutes when all guards were clustered together, rather than maintaining surveillance of the surrounding area. On the evening of March 23rd, Bill positioned himself in forest behind Morrison's barn at 4 in the afternoon, 2 hours before the scheduled shift change. He lay motionless behind a fallen oak tree approximately 170 yards from the barn, Old Death loaded and ready, waiting with the infinite patience that had made him legendary as a bear hunter. He watched as sunset approached, as the evening detail arrived and parked their wagon near the barn, as the morning detail emerged from the barn to conduct the shift change briefing. Bill's target was not the guards. His target was Robert Morrison, who emerged from his cabin at 6:15, walking toward the barn to speak with the protection detail, apparently feeling secure with 8 armed deputies present on his property. Morrison walked casually across the open ground between his cabin and barn, completely exposed, his attention focused on the guards rather than the surrounding forest. Old Death's report shattered the evening quiet. Morrison stumbled, clutched at his chest, and collapsed in the farmyard. The guards scattered immediately, some dropping to the ground, others running for cover, all of them trying to determine the direction of the shot. Bill was already moving, reloading as he melted back into the forest, putting distance between himself and Morrison's farm before the guards could organize any kind of pursuit. The shooting demonstrated the fundamental problem with Brennan's security plan. Even with 8 armed guards present, even with cleared fields and prepared positions, Bill Walker had eliminated his target by waiting patiently for the moment when Morrison felt secure enough to expose himself. The old mountaineer had turned the protection detail's presence into a liability by recognizing that Morrison would emerge from his fortified cabin specifically because guards were present, and he felt safe. Sheriff Brennan learned of Morrison's death within 2 hours, realized immediately that his protection plan was failing, that Bill Walker was not deterred by armed guards and enhanced security measures. The sheriff faced impossible situation. 2 deputies remained alive, both terrified, both demanding protection that Brennan could not effectively provide against opponent who fought from the shadows and struck when and where he chose. Deputy Thomas Mitchell took Morrison's death particularly hard. Mitchell had actively participated in beating Molly Stinnett, had held the woman while Morrison executed her, understood that he was next on Bill Walker's list. Mitchell demanded that Brennan send him and his family out of the county, argued that staying in the area meant certain death when Walker had proven capable of reaching targets regardless of security measures. Brennan denied the request. Allowing deputies to flee would acknowledge that law enforcement was powerless against Bill Walker, would encourage other mountain families to resist timber company and sheriff's department pressure. Mitchell and Deputy Marcus Sutton, the last two surviving raiders, would remain in Sevier County under armed guard until Bill Walker was captured or killed. Brennan ordered both men moved to the courthouse jail, where they would remain in cells under constant guard, the only location where the sheriff believed he could maintain adequate security. The decision to jail Mitchell and Sutton for their own protection created a bizarre situation where deputies who had committed murder were being confined like prisoners while the man pursuing them remained free in the mountains. The arrangement highlighted the moral bankruptcy of the entire situation. The authorities were protecting murderers from justice being delivered by family member of their victims, using law enforcement resources to shield corrupt deputies from consequences of their crimes. Bill learned through his children about Mitchell and Sutton's confinement in the courthouse jail. The information presented a significant tactical challenge because the courthouse was located in downtown Sevierville, surrounded by occupied buildings with multiple armed guards maintaining watch 24 hours a day. Approaching the courthouse would expose Bill to detection and capture, eliminating the wilderness advantages that had allowed him to kill 4 deputies without being seen or identified. But Bill had not survived 78 years in the mountains by giving up when situations became difficult. He studied the courthouse from multiple concealed positions throughout late March, noted that guards on the roof maintained surveillance of surrounding streets, but paid less attention to the forest behind the building, where thick woods came within 200 yards of the courthouse's rear wall. More importantly, Bill observed that prisoners in the courthouse jail exercised in a small courtyard behind the building each morning at 8 o'clock, guarded by 2 deputies but visible from the forest. On March 28th, Bill positioned himself in the forest behind the courthouse at 6 in the morning, concealed in a dense laurel thicket, approximately 190 yards from the exercise courtyard. He waited through the dawn hours, motionless except for occasionally shifting his weight to prevent cramping, Old Death resting across his knees, ready to fire. Mitchell and Sutton emerged into the exercise courtyard at 8 o'clock, accompanied by 2 guards who stood watch from opposite corners of the walled enclosure. The deputies were not shackled, were apparently being treated as guests rather than prisoners, their confinement meant to protect rather than punish them. The arrangement meant they moved freely within the courtyard, providing Bill with clear shots if he could time his shooting correctly. Bill waited until Mitchell walked toward the courtyard's center, until the deputy stood isolated from Sutton and the guards, until Old Death's sight picture was perfect. The rifle's report echoed across downtown Sevierville. Mitchell fell instantly, the 2-ounce ball striking him in the upper chest, killing him within seconds. Before the guards could react, before Sutton could run for cover, Bill reloaded with the speed that came from 60 years of practice and fired again. Sutton was struck in the back as he ran toward the courthouse door, the ball penetrating his spine, dropping him face first onto the courtyard flagstones. Bill did not wait to confirm the kills. The shots from behind the courthouse would draw immediate response from every law enforcement officer in Sevierville. He moved quickly through the forest, following game trails that led away from town, using terrain features to mask his movement from any pursuers. Within 15 minutes, Bill was a mile from the courthouse, moving steadily deeper into the mountains, leaving behind 6 dead deputies and a sheriff's department that had been thoroughly defeated by a 78-year-old man with a Revolutionary War rifle. The elimination of Mitchell and Sutton inside the courthouse jail, despite guards and security measures, represented total failure of Brennan's protection efforts. All 6 deputies who had participated in the Walker Valley raid were dead, killed within 13 days by systematic campaign that had demonstrated the futility of trying to protect corrupt law enforcement officers from mountain justice delivered by man who knew the terrain better than anyone alive. Sheriff Brennan held a press conference on March 29th, attempting to spin the disaster into something resembling law enforcement success. He announced that Bill Walker was wanted for 6 counts of first-degree murder, that a reward of $500 was being offered for information leading to his capture, that every available officer in East Tennessee was searching for the fugitive mountaineer who had terrorized Sevier County for 2 weeks. The press conference convinced no one. Newspapers throughout Tennessee ran stories describing how an elderly bear hunter had systematically eliminated 6 deputies who had murdered his wives and son, how Sheriff Brennan's corrupt relationship with timber companies had motivated the original raid on Walker Valley, how Bill Walker's campaign represented frontier justice delivered when official law enforcement served commercial interests rather than protecting citizens. The publicity was devastating for Brennan and the timber companies. The Little River Lumber Company faced boycotts from workers who refused to participate in operations that depended on murdering mountain families. Several state legislators called for investigations into Brennan's relationship with timber interests. Most significantly, other mountain families who had been pressured to sell their property to logging companies found new courage to resist, understanding that some men would fight back against corruption, that timber barons and corrupt sheriffs were not invulnerable. Bill Walker returned to Walker Valley in early April 1917, emerging from the mountains like a ghost returning to haunt the scene of crimes that had destroyed his family. His children gathered around him, received him as returning hero rather than fugitive murderer, understood that their father had done what needed to be done, that the 6 deputies' deaths had restored family honor and demonstrated that mountain people would not tolerate official violence against their families. The old mountaineer visited the graves of Nancy, Mary, Molly, and William, knelt beside the 4 wooden crosses, reported that his promise had been fulfilled, that every man who had participated in their murders had paid with his life. Bill's voice was quiet as he spoke to the dead. I kept my word. All 6 are gone. The law won't call it justice, but we know different. You're avenged, and everyone in these mountains knows that Walker family stands by its own. Bill lived another 2 years in Walker Valley, dying in February 1919 at age 80 from a massive heart attack while working on his property. His funeral drew over 400 mourners from throughout the Great Smoky Mountains, a testament to the legendary status he had achieved both as a hunter and as a man who had delivered justice when official law enforcement served corrupt interests. Multiple speakers delivered eulogies celebrating Bill as defender of mountain culture, protector of family honor, an embodiment of the independence that had defined Appalachian people for generations. The Walker Valley campaign became legend throughout Tennessee and beyond, told and retold in communities where people understood that sometimes justice required action outside legal systems that had been corrupted by commercial interests and political ambition. Bill Walker's story was complicated. He was simultaneously a murderer who had killed 6 law enforcement officers and a folk hero who had defended his family against corrupt deputies who had massacred elderly women and then claimed legal authority justified their crimes. If this account of how Black Bill Walker systematically hunted 6 corrupt deputies through the Great Smoky Mountains, using 60 years of hunting experience and a Revolutionary War rifle to deliver justice that official law enforcement refused to provide, has made you consider the complex relationship between legal authority and moral justice, leave your like and share. Subscribe for Part 4, the final chapter, where we'll examine the lasting legacy of Bill Walker's campaign, how it influenced mountain culture and law enforcement reform, the complicated memory of a man who was both beloved grandfather and a deadly avenger, and what his story reveals about justice, vengeance, and the codes that governed Appalachian communities when official law was corrupted beyond recognition. The immediate aftermath of Bill Walker's systematic elimination of 6 Sevier County deputies created unprecedented crisis for Tennessee law enforcement and political establishment. By April 1917, the state faced a situation where a 78-year-old mountaineer had defeated corrupt sheriff's department, exposed collusion between law enforcement and timber companies, and demonstrated that official authority provided no protection when officers murdered innocent citizens. The crisis forced examination of how deeply commercial interests had penetrated rural law enforcement, how frequently badges were used to serve corporate profit rather than public safety, and whether mountain communities would continue tolerating official violence disguised as legitimate law enforcement activity. Tennessee Governor Tom Rye ordered the Attorney General's office to investigate the Walker Valley raid and subsequent killings in April 1917. The investigation was politically sensitive because fully exposing Sheriff Brennan's corruption would reveal that state officials had known about timber company payments to law enforcement for years, but had done nothing to stop the practice. Governor Rye needed investigation that would satisfy public demand for accountability, without triggering broader examination of how pervasively commercial interests controlled rural Tennessee politics. The Attorney General's report, released in June 1917, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic evasion. The report concluded that Sheriff Brennan had exercised poor judgment in conducting the Walker Valley raid, that the deaths of Nancy Walker, Mary Moore, Molly Stinnett, and William Walker were regrettable consequences of warrant service that escalated beyond appropriate use of force. The report acknowledged that the anti-polygamy warrant had been pretextual, but stopped short of explicitly stating that the raid had been murder for hire arranged by timber companies seeking to eliminate Bill Walker's resistance to selling his property. Regarding Bill Walker's killing of 6 deputies, the report concluded that while the shootings constituted first-degree murder under Tennessee law, mitigating circumstances including advanced age, grief over family deaths, and perceived failure of legal system to provide justice should be considered if Walker were ever apprehended and prosecuted. The language was carefully crafted to avoid explicitly condoning vigilante violence, while acknowledging that Bill's actions had been motivated by legitimate grievances against corrupt law enforcement. Most significantly, the report recommended that Sheriff Brennan be removed from office, that deputies involved in the Walker Valley raid face criminal charges for excessive force, and that Tennessee implement reforms prohibiting law enforcement officers from receiving payments from commercial interests. The recommendations were politically popular but practically meaningless. All 6 deputies who had participated in the raid were already dead, and Brennan resigned before he could be formally removed, avoiding criminal prosecution by accepting early retirement with full pension. The investigation's failure to deliver meaningful accountability enraged Bill Walker's family and mountain communities throughout East Tennessee. William Walker, Jr., Bill's oldest surviving son, published an open letter in the Knoxville Journal in July 1917 titled, "When Justice Fails, Men Must Act." The letter detailed the timber company's campaign to seize Walker Valley, described the brutality of the March 15th raid, and defended his father's actions as a necessary response to official murder that authorities had no intention of prosecuting. William's letter included devastating detail. My father watched his wife, Nancy, die from internal injuries caused by Deputy Patterson beating a 78-year-old woman who posed no threat to anyone. He found his wife, Mary, shot in the back while running away from deputies who were supposed to be serving a warrant, not executing women. He discovered his wife, Molly, executed with a shot to the back of her head after being beaten by deputies who wanted her to reveal non-existent hidden money. My brother, William, was shot dead trying to protect our mother from men wearing badges but acting like murderers. The letter continued. The Attorney General says my father committed murder by killing 6 deputies. I say my father delivered justice when the legal system refused to act. Sheriff Brennan was paid by timber companies to eliminate resistance to their operations. The Walker Valley raid was murder disguised as law enforcement. My father's response was appropriate under mountain codes that have governed our people for generations. Blood for blood, life for life. Accountability for those who believe badges place them above the fundamental human obligation to not murder innocent people. William concluded, My father is 80 years old. He killed 6 trained deputies using a rifle that was carried at the Battle of Kings Mountain during the Revolution. He did what needed to be done, and now he's at peace on his land, surrounded by family who love him and neighbors who respect what he accomplished. The state calls him a murderer. We call him a man who stood up when standing up mattered, who showed that mountain families will fight back when official law becomes tool of corporate greed rather than protector of citizens. The letter generated intense debate throughout Tennessee and received national attention when major newspapers in New York, Chicago, and Boston reprinted it alongside commentary about frontier justice, law enforcement corruption, and the persistent tension between official legal systems and local codes of honor that governed communities where state authority was distant and often illegitimate. Sheriff Brennan's resignation in July 1917 did not end his involvement in the Walker Valley situation. The Little River Lumber Company, facing public relations disaster from the raid's exposure, quietly paid Brennan $50,000 in exchange for his silence about the full extent of timber company involvement in corrupting Sevier County law enforcement. Brennan used the money to relocate to Memphis, where he lived comfortably until his death in 1934, never facing criminal charges for orchestrating the murders of 4 members of the Walker family. The injustice of Brennan's escape from accountability was not lost on Bill Walker, who spent his final 2 years in Walker Valley working his land, teaching grandchildren his hunting and tracking skills, and occasionally commenting to visitors about the corruption that had destroyed his family. In one recorded conversation from August 1918, Bill told a journalist from the Knoxville News-Sentinel, I'm an old man who's lived past my time. I killed 6 men who murdered my wives and son. The law says that makes me a criminal. Mountain justice says it makes me a man who stood by his family when badges and courts failed completely. I'll face God's judgment when my time comes, and I'll tell him the same thing I'm telling you. I did what needed doing, and I'd do it again. The journalist asked Bill if he regretted the killings. Bill's response was simple. I regret that my wives and son are dead. I regret that timber companies and corrupt sheriffs thought they could murder mountain families without consequences. I don't regret making those 6 deputies understand, in their final moments, that badges don't protect men who kill innocent women. Old Death delivered the only justice my family was going to receive, and that's justice enough for me. Bill Walker died February 8, 1919. At age 80, massive heart attack taking him while he was repairing fences on his property. His death was peaceful and quick, sparing the old mountaineer the slow decline that claimed many men his age. Bill's children found him lying in the pasture, Old Death leaning against the fence post beside him, the rifle that had killed hundreds of bears and 6 corrupt deputies, keeping silent watch over its master one final time. Bill's funeral on February 12, 1919 became demonstration of how mountain communities viewed his actions. Over 400 mourners attended, including families from throughout the Great Smoky Mountains who came to pay respects to man who had embodied mountain independence and family loyalty. Several speakers delivered eulogies that carefully avoided explicitly praising Bill's killing of 6 deputies while making clear that everyone present understood his actions had been justified by the circumstances that had destroyed his family. Bill's son William delivered the primary eulogy, standing beside his father's casket with Old Death resting across his arms. My father was born in 1838, grew up in these mountains, learned their ways, and lived according to the codes that have governed our people for generations. He was the finest hunter the Smokies ever produced, a man who knew every ridge and hollow, who could track any animal, who never took more than he needed and always respected the forest that provided for his family. William paused, his gaze moving across the assembled mourners. In March 1917, corrupt deputies murdered my father's 3 wives and one of my brothers. They died because my father refused to sell Walker Valley to timber companies who wanted to destroy the last virgin forest in these mountains. The deputies claimed they were serving a warrant. Actually, they were murdering elderly women who posed no threat to anyone. The law did nothing to punish these murders because Sheriff Brennan was paid by the timber companies to protect their interests rather than innocent citizens. The eulogy's conclusion was direct. My father responded the only way a mountain man could respond when legal system failed completely. He hunted the 6 deputies who had destroyed his family. He used Old Death, the rifle his father carried at Kings Mountain, the weapon that had fed Walker family for 80 years. He killed all 6 men within 2 weeks, using skills he'd developed over 6 decades of hunting. The state called him a murderer. We know he was a man who delivered justice when justice was denied through official channels corrupted by commercial greed. Bill was buried in the Walker family cemetery on the hillside, above where Nancy's cabin had stood before Brennan's deputies burned it. The grave was positioned between Nancy's plot and Mary's, with Molly's grave on the other side, reuniting Bill with the 3 women whose murders had transformed him from peaceful conservationist into avenging angel. The gravestone was simple. William Black Bill Walker, 1838-1919. Hunter, father, defender of family honor. Old Death was not buried with Bill. Following mountain tradition, the rifle passed to William Jr., who kept it above his fireplace for 30 years before passing it to his own son in 1949. The weapon remained in the Walker family through multiple generations, each inheritor understanding that Old Death represented both Bill's legendary hunting prowess and his final campaign of justice against corrupt deputies who had murdered his wives and son. The rifle's history made it a valuable artifact, and in the 1980s, the Walker family received multiple offers from collectors and museums wanting to acquire Old Death for display. The family declined all offers, maintaining that the rifle belonged in Walker Valley, where it had killed hundreds of animals and 6 corrupt law enforcement officers, where its presence reminded everyone that mountain justice sometimes required violence when official law served commercial interests rather than protecting citizens. In 2023, the Walker family donated Old Death to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park Museum, where the rifle is displayed alongside interpretation, explaining Bill Walker's life as hunter, conservationist, and controversial figure who killed 6 deputies after they murdered his wives and son. The museum text carefully balances historical accuracy with sensitivity to the complicated legacy Bill left behind. He was simultaneously legendary hunter, devoted father, principled conservationist who preserved virgin forest, and vigilante killer who murdered 6 law enforcement officers in systematic campaign of revenge. The Walker Valley property itself was eventually sold to the Little River Lumber Company in 1922, 3 years after Bill's death. His children, facing financial pressures and lacking their father's determination to resist commercial development, accepted the company's offer and watched as the virgin forest Bill had protected for 60 years was systematically logged. The massive chestnuts that had stood for centuries, the oaks and poplars that had provided habitat for the bears Bill had hunted, all fell to saws operated by crews who moved through Walker Valley like the timber companies had moved through the rest of the Smokies. The destruction of Walker Valley's forest became bitter postscript to Bill's life and death. He had refused to sell, had fought to preserve the wilderness he loved, had even killed 6 deputies who were attempting to force the sale through murdering his family. But ultimately, commercial interests won, as they usually did in Appalachia during the early 20th century. Walker Valley became another clear-cut mountainside, another example of irreplaceable natural heritage destroyed for short-term profit. However, Bill's broader legacy proved more durable than his forest. His campaign against corrupt deputies contributed to law enforcement reform throughout Tennessee. The state legislature passed laws in 1920 prohibiting sheriffs from receiving payments from commercial interests, requiring independent investigations of any use of force resulting in civilian deaths, as well as establishing oversight mechanisms for rural law enforcement agencies where corruption had been endemic. The reforms were directly influenced by publicity surrounding the Walker Valley case and public outrage over Brennan's escape from accountability. Mountain communities throughout Appalachia drew lessons from Bill's story. Other families facing pressure from timber companies found courage to resist, understanding that some men would fight back against corruption. That official authority was not absolute when it served commercial greed rather than justice. The resistance was not always violent. Most families used legal challenges and publicity campaigns rather than Bill's direct action approach. But the willingness to stand against powerful interests reflected the inspiration Bill's campaign had provided. Bill Walker's story also influenced broader cultural narratives about Appalachian independence and resistance to outside exploitation. Writers, historians, and folklorists documented his life as an example of mountain codes that prioritized family loyalty and personal honor over legal authority that had been corrupted. The story was told and retold in communities where people understood that sometimes law and justice diverged so completely that individuals had to choose which to serve, and that choosing justice over law could be both morally necessary and legally criminal. The complexity of Bill's legacy became apparent in 1995 when Tennessee historical marker was proposed for Walker Valley, commemorating Bill's life and the March 1917 raid that had destroyed his family. Law enforcement organizations objected that official state marker would appear to condone violence against police officers, that celebrating Bill Walker meant endorsing cop killing motivated by personal grievance regardless of how legitimate that grievance might have been. Supporters of the marker argued that Bill's actions needed to be understood in context of systemic corruption that had made legal remedies impossible, that the marker would educate visitors about dark period when sheriffs served timber companies rather than citizens, that acknowledging complicated history was more appropriate than sanitizing past to avoid uncomfortable truths about law enforcement failures. The controversy was resolved through compromise marker text that presented facts without explicitly judging Bill's actions. The marker, installed in 1997 at the entrance to what had been Walker Valley, reads, "William Black Bill Walker, 1838-1919, settled this valley in 1859, becoming renowned as the finest hunter in the Great Smoky Mountains. In March 1917, his 3 wives and 1 son were killed during raid by Sevier County deputies, serving warrant related to Walker's plural marriage arrangement. Walker subsequently killed 6 deputies involved in the raid, using his legendary rifle, Old Death, in systematic campaign that lasted 2 weeks. Walker died in 1919, having never been prosecuted for the killings. This site illustrates tensions between commercial development, law enforcement corruption, and mountain codes of justice during early 20th century Appalachia. The marker's neutral language satisfied neither side completely, but allowed history to be commemorated without the state appearing to explicitly endorse either law enforcement violence against civilians or vigilante revenge against corrupt officers. Visitors to the site could read the facts and draw their own conclusions about whether Bill's actions were justified, whether the deputies deserved their fate, whether violence could ever be appropriate response to official murder disguised as legitimate law enforcement. By the 21st century, Bill Walker had become folk hero in certain Appalachian communities, villain in law enforcement narratives, and complicated historical figure in academic treatments of his life and times. His story appeared in books about mountain culture, frontier justice, law enforcement corruption, and the environmental destruction of the Great Smoky Mountains. Each treatment emphasized different aspects of his life: legendary hunter, devoted father, principled conservationist, systematic killer, reflecting the impossibility of reducing Bill's 78 years to simple, heroic, or villainous narrative. Walker family descendants, numbering over 500 by 2024, maintained complicated relationship with their ancestors' legacy. Most took pride in Bill's hunting prowess, his conservation efforts, and his refusal to sell Walker Valley's virgin forest. Many defended his killing of the 6 deputies as justified response to murder of his wives and son. Others, particularly those in law enforcement careers, struggled with honoring ancestor who had systematically killed police officers, even corrupt officers who had committed murder themselves. The family held reunion in Walker Valley in August 2017, 100th anniversary of Bill's campaign against Brennan's deputies. Over 200 descendants gathered at the site where Bill's cabin had stood, visited the family cemetery where Bill lay buried with Nancy, Mary, and Molly, and discussed how their ancestors' actions should be remembered and taught to younger generations who had no personal connection to the events of March 1917. Sarah Walker Thompson, Bill's great-great-granddaughter and retired schoolteacher, addressed the assembled family. Our ancestor did something that was both understandable and terrible. He killed 6 men in revenge for murders of his wives and son. We can understand his motivation. Those deputies murdered elderly women who posed no threat, burned his cabin, destroyed his family. We can recognize that legal system provided no justice because Sheriff Brennan was corrupt and served timber company interests. But we also have to acknowledge that Bill committed murder, that 6 men died, that their families suffered loss, just like our family suffered loss when Nancy, Mary, Molly, and William were killed. Sarah continued, I think Bill would want us to remember the whole truth, not sanitized version that makes him either pure hero or pure villain. He was complicated man who lived in complicated times, who responded to terrible situation in a way that reflected mountain codes that don't translate well to modern legal and moral frameworks. We can honor his memory without endorsing everything he did. We can acknowledge that what happened in 1917 was tragedy all around. Tragic that timber companies corrupted law enforcement. Tragic that deputies murdered innocent women. Tragic that Bill felt violence was only response available. Tragic that 6 more men died in revenge campaign that solved nothing except satisfying a mountain code requiring blood for blood. The reunion concluded with ceremony at Bill's grave, where family members placed stones on the marker, Appalachian tradition honoring deceased by physically adding to their memorial. William Walker, Bill's great-great-great-grandson and active duty police officer, placed the final stone, then spoke briefly. I wear a badge today. I serve law enforcement community. I also recognize that my ancestor killed 6 officers who wore badges but acted like murderers. I don't have to choose between honoring Bill and respecting law enforcement generally. I can acknowledge that 1917 represented failure of institutions that should have protected citizens rather than serving commercial interests. I can commit to being the kind of officer that doesn't make families choose between legal authority and justice. The reconciliation represented generational healing, acknowledging that Bill's story defied simple moral categories, that understanding history required accepting ambiguity rather than forcing events into narratives where one side was completely right and the other completely wrong. The Walker family's willingness to grapple honestly with their ancestors' complicated legacy provided model for how communities could address difficult histories without either defending indefensible actions or dismissing legitimate grievances that had motivated those actions. Today, Walker Valley remains largely uninhabited, part of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park that was established in 1934, 15 years after Bill's death. The forest has regenerated somewhat, though the virgin chestnuts that Bill knew are gone, victims of blight disease that swept through Appalachia in the 1930s. Hikers walking the trails through what was once Bill's property can see remnants of cabin foundations, old fence lines, and the family cemetery where Bill, Nancy, Mary, Molly, and William rest beneath simple markers. The Great Smoky Mountains National Park offers interpretive programs about Bill Walker during summer months, presentations that explore his life as hunter, his role in conservation, and the controversial 1917 events that ended his wives' lives and the lives of 6 deputies. The programs draw diverse audiences, some attending because they admire Bill's resistance to timber companies, others interested in frontier justice narratives, still others studying law enforcement history and how corruption shaped Appalachian development during the industrial era. Park interpreters are trained to present Bill's story without advocacy, to provide historical context while allowing visitors to form their own judgments about whether his actions were justified, whether alternatives existed, whether violence could ever be appropriate response to official corruption and murder. The approach reflects broader shift in how public history addresses complicated figures whose actions defy easy categorization, whose legacies include both admirable achievements and morally questionable violence. In the end, Black Bill Walker's story persists because it forces examination of questions that remain relevant beyond the specific circumstances of 1917 Walker Valley. When legal systems are corrupted by commercial interests, what remedies exist for citizens seeking justice? When law enforcement officers commit murder while claiming official authority, how should communities respond? When family members are killed and authorities refuse to prosecute, does personal vengeance become legitimate, or does it simply add more violence to initial tragedy? Bill Walker's answer was clear. He chose violence, used Old Death to systematically eliminate 6 corrupt deputies, and died 2 years later having never expressed regret for killings that the state called murder and his family called justice. Whether that answer was right remains questioned. Each person must answer individually, informed by their own values regarding family loyalty, legal authority, violence, and the ancient mountain codes that Bill lived by until his final breath. If this complete story of Black Bill Walker, legendary hunter who became systematic killer, devoted father who murdered 6 men, principled conservationist who defended family honor through campaign of violence that forced reckoning with law enforcement corruption, has made you contemplate the impossible choices people face when institutions fail. When badges protect murderers rather than innocent citizens, when grief and justice collide in ways that defy simple moral categories, leave your like and share this video. Subscribe for more true stories from Appalachia's past, narratives that refuse to sanitize history, that present complicated figures honestly, that acknowledge both human capacity for remarkable achievement and terrible violence when circumstances push people beyond limits that civilized society assumes everyone respects. Comment about whether Bill's actions were justified, whether 6 deputies deserve their fate, whether violence can ever be appropriate response to official murder, whether his legacy should emphasize legendary hunting prowess or systematic revenge killings. Because these questions persist wherever corruption meets resistance, wherever law and justice diverge, wherever families must decide how to respond when those sworn to protect them become their murderers instead. Until next time, remember that Bill Walker lived 78 years in the Great Smoky Mountains, raised 26 children, preserved 8 square miles of virgin forest, and killed 6 corrupt deputies who murdered his wives and son. Remember that Old Death, the rifle that fed his family for 6 decades, spoke its final words delivering justice that legal system refused to provide. Remember that history's most compelling figures rarely fit comfortable categories, that understanding past requires accepting ambiguity, that sometimes the only honest answer to whether someone was hero or villain is acknowledging they were both and neither and forever complicated.